They said no man would ever wed a barren widow past 40, and Della Winslow had heard the saying so often in Verdigris Basin that she'd stopped flinching at it, right up until the evening she heard it fall from Ottilie Marshmouth on the church steps, pitched just loud enough to carry. While Vernon Storworth stood not 6 feet away collecting his hat from the rack, a shame really, Ottilie was saying to her circle of nodding companions, a woman of her quality, gone to waste on account of nature's cruelty. No man wants a wife who can't give him sons, whatever her other virtues. I only say it because I pity her. Della kept her chin level and her eyes on the door, the way she had trained herself to do these 4 years since Amos died and left her a widow with a little house, a smaller income, and a body that had never once, in 11 years of marriage, quickened with a child. She had buried that particular grief so many times she'd thought the ground over it packed solid. It still had the power to open up beneath her without warning. "Mrs. Marsh," Vernon Storworth said, and his voice, though quiet, cut through the churchyard chatter the way a dropped stone cuts through still water. "I find pity a poor substitute for manners, and manners a poor substitute for silence, when a woman's private sorrows are the topic under discussion." Ottilie's face went the color of a boiled ham. "Mr. Storworth, I only meant—" "I know precisely what you meant." He settled his hat on his head with the unhurried calm of a man who owned more of Verdigris Basin than any other 3 ranchers combined and had never once needed to raise his voice to prove it. "Good evening, ladies." He didn't look at Della as he said it, didn't so much as glance her way, sparing her the indignity of being seen to need defending, and for that alone she could have wept with gratitude right there on the church steps. Instead, she gathered her skirts and walked the mile home alone, as she always did, and told herself firmly that a rich man's passing courtesy toward a gossip meant nothing at all about how he regarded her, and that she had best not build so much as a splinter of hope on it. She built quite a lot of hope on it anyway, in the privacy of her own mind, and despised herself a little for it. The truth was Della had grown used to being written off. It happened in small ways most days. The mercantile clerk who addressed his cheerful patter to every other woman in line and fell silent and awkward when it came her turn, as though her circumstances were a contagion best not risked with conversation. The church committee that had quietly stopped asking her to help with the children's Christmas pageant 3 years running, on the unspoken theory that a barren woman had no business near other people's babies, whatever her actual gentleness with them. The sidelong looks at the harvest social when the other wives clustered to discuss their children's doings and left a Della-shaped gap in the circle, without ever quite meaning to be cruel about it. She had learned to carry herself as though none of it touched her, a skill 4 years in the polishing, and she had gotten good enough at it that most people believed the armor was the whole of her. Della had known Vernon Storworth the way everyone in the basin knew him. By reputation more than acquaintance, a widower himself these 6 years, the wealthiest rancher for 2 counties in any direction. A man of few words and fewer public sentiments who ran the Circle Bar with a steadiness that had weathered 2 droughts and a market collapse without once laying off a hand. She took in mending to make ends meet, a skill Amos's modest life insurance hadn't stretched far enough to render unnecessary, and it was mending of all the unlikely doors for fate to knock on that brought her properly into his orbit that autumn. His housekeeper, old Mrs. Dunmore, had gone to nurse a sister in Cheyenne, and the ranch house at the Circle Bar had accumulated a backlog of torn shirts and split seams that no amount of male competence could resolve. Vernon's foreman, a weathered, kindly man named Otis Reams, was the one who suggested Della's name, and it was Otis who drove the wagon out to fetch her that first Tuesday, apologizing the whole ride for the imposition. He'd never have asked outright, Otis confided, guiding the team down the rutted lane. Vernon's proud that way. Doesn't like admitting he can't manage a household on his own, though the good Lord knows he can't. But he needs the mending done, and you need the work, and I got tired of watching 2 stubborn people circle each other rather than say so. You make it sound like matchmaking, Mr. Reams. Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am. But Otis was smiling at the road ahead in a way that suggested he'd dreamed of exactly that, and possibly for some while. The Circle Bar ranch house was larger than anything Della had set foot in since her girlhood, all polished floors and good, plain furniture, entirely too much house for one widower and a scattering of hired hands who ate in the bunkhouse. Vernon himself was out at the North Range when she arrived, and she spent the first day in blessed, uncomplicated solitude, working through a basket of shirts with a competence that felt like coming up for air after years of scraping by on odd jobs and thin margins. He came in at dusk, weathered and quiet, and stopped short in the doorway of the sitting room at the sight of bent over his second-best coat with a needle flashing in the lamplight. "Mrs. Winslow." He removed his hat. "Otis didn't tell me who he'd hired." "Would it have changed your mind, Mr. Stallworth?" "No." He said it simply, without the elaborate reassurance a lesser man might have offered, and something about the plainness of it settled her more than flattery would have. It would only have meant I spent the day at the North Range wondering instead of working, and the cattle don't care for a distracted hand at branding season. She laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh surprised out of her, and he looked, for just a moment, startled and pleased in equal measure, as though he hadn't expected to cause it and wasn't entirely sure what to do with having succeeded. He asked her to stay for supper that first evening, an invitation offered with such careful casualness that she understood at once it cost him something to make it. They ate at the long kitchen table rather than the formal dining room, which she suspected was deliberate, a man's quiet way of admitting he found the dining room's emptiness harder to bear than the kitchen's plain warmth. He asked about Amos, and she found herself telling him, really telling him, more than she'd told anyone in 4 years, about the 11 good years of a marriage that had never needed children to be full, about the particular guilt of grieving a husband and, underneath it, some other grief the town had never once let her name aloud. The grief of a life that had turned out different than the one she'd imagined as a girl. "I don't believe grief needs children in it to be real," Vernon said, when she'd finished, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "Margaret and I spent 11 years hoping, and 11 years grieving the hope a little more each time it didn't come to pass, and I loved her exactly as much on the day she died as the day I married her. I've never once believed the two things, loving a woman and her bearing children, were as tangled together as Basin seems determined to insist they are." It was the first time anyone besides Amos had said such a thing to her plainly, without pity riding underneath it, and Della found she had to look down at her own hands for a moment before she trusted her voice again. She came twice a week through October, then 3 times, then by the wordless agreement of 2 people, neither one willing to name what was happening, most days the weather allowed. There was always mending, real or invented. Della began to suspect Vernon had taken to terems deliberately, a suspicion that hardened into certainty the day she found an entirely unworn shirt with a perfectly straight cut down one sleeve, the kind of tear that came from scissors, not labor. "Mr. Stallworth," she said, holding it up, "this shirt has never been within a mile of a cow." He had the grace to look abashed, a large, weathered man of 51 caught out like a schoolboy. "I may have been overzealous in generating occasion for your visits. You could simply have asked me to stay for supper." "I could have," he agreed. "I find I'm out of practice asking for things I want plainly. It's easier, somehow, to ruin a perfectly good shirt. That's the most roundabout courting I've ever heard of." "Is that what this is?" he asked, and something in his voice had gone careful, almost afraid of the answer, though careful and afraid sat strangely on a man built like a mountain and twice as steady. Della's heart was beating harder than the question warranted. "I couldn't say, Mr. Stallworth. I'm 43 years old, a widow with no children and no great fortune, and half the Basin considers me a cautionary tale rather than a prospect. I'd advise you look elsewhere for courting, if courting's what you're after. There are younger women in this county who'd give you sons." "I had a wife who gave me no children in 11 years of marriage," Vernon said quietly, "and buried her with ever once wondering whether that made her less precious to me. Margaret was the finest woman I ever knew, barrenness and all, and when the fever took her 6 years ago, I decided I'd rather live alone the rest of my days than pretend a woman's worth could be measured in the children she did or didn't bear. I'm not looking for sons, Mrs. Winslow. I have nephews enough to inherit the Circle Bar and no shortage of hands to run it. I am looking, very badly and very clumsily, For someone to sit across the supper table from me who doesn't make me feel like the loneliest rich man in the territory. Della stood very still, the needle forgotten in her hand, 4 years of carefully buried hope cracking open at once. The whole basin will say you've lost your senses, taking up with a woman my age, my circumstances. The whole basin, Vernon said, has never once paid my mortgage, mended my shirts honestly torn or dishonestly, or made me laugh at my own foolishness the way you did not 3 weeks past. I find I care rather less for the basin's opinion than I once believed I did. It was around this time that Della first heard the name Flora Nash spoken in the same breath as Vernon's, and felt something cold settle low in her stomach at the sound of it. Flora was 21, the banker's youngest daughter, pretty in the unremarkable way of a girl who has never once had to work for anything, and her mother had apparently decided, over tea at the Ladies' Aid, that the Circle Bar wanted a proper young mistress and that her Flora was precisely the article required. Della heard the talk secondhand as always, Mrs. Nash's confident predictions that Vernon would come to his senses by spring, that a man of his position surely couldn't be seriously entertaining a widow of Della's age and circumstance when a fresh, fertile young bride was there for the asking. She said nothing of it to Vernon, told herself firmly it was beneath her to repeat gossip, and then undid the resolution not 4 days later at his own supper table, watching him across the lamplight and unable to keep the question locked behind her teeth any longer. Mrs. Nash, to anyone who'll listen that you'll come round to Flora by spring, she said, keeping her voice light and not quite managing it, that a man in your position oughtn't settle for less than a young wife who can give him an hair proper. Vernon set down his fork with a care that told her he'd heard the same talk and had simply chosen not to burden her with it. Flora Nash is a pleasant enough girl and has never once, in my hearing, had an original thought or asked me a single question about anything beyond the size of the ranch house. I have supped with her mother's schemes 3 times this autumn at that woman's determined invitation, and each time come home more certain of what I actually want, which is a woman who argues with me about scripture and mends my shirts honestly, and doesn't give one particular fig for the size of my house. I'd have thought that plain by now, Della, but I'll say it as many times as it takes to settle in. Something in her chest loosened at the sound of her given name in his mouth for the first time, plain and unadorned, and she found she believed him rather more than she believed Mrs. Nash's confident predictions over Ladies' Aid tea. Word got out, as word in a small basin always does, and by November it seemed the whole of Verdigris had an opinion on the matter, most of them uninvited and few of them kind. Ottilie Marsh, still smarting from her public correction on the church steps, made it her particular mission to remind anyone who'd listen that Vernon Storworth, at 51, could surely do better than a barren widow of no particular fortune, and that his late wife's family, the Delacroix, a proud old Virginia line with a strong presence in Cheyenne's society, would be scandalized to see the Circle Bar's name attached to a mender of shirts. The talk reached Della secondhand, the way it always did, through the mercantile and the church socials, and the particular cruelty of women who smiled to her face and gossiped the moment her back was turned. She bore it as she'd borne 4 years of similar talk, with a spine straightened by long practice, though she noticed it had begun to cost her more than it once had, now that there was something real at stake to lose. The true test came when Vernon's sister-in-law, Cordelia Delacroix Ashworth, arrived from Cheyenne in December, a formidable woman in expensive mourning black who had appointed herself guardian of her late sister Margaret's memory and, by extension, of Vernon's future. "I understand," Cordelia said, seated in the Circle Bar's finest parlor chair as though she owned it, "that you've been keeping company with my brother-in-law. I've been mending his shirts, Mrs. Ashworth, and lately taking supper with him." I wouldn't presume to characterize it further than that. Della kept her hands folded and her voice level, though her heart hammered. Let us not be coy. The whole basin characterizes it plainly enough, and unkindly, which I confess surprises me not at all. Cordelia's gaze traveled over Della's plain, mended dress with an appraisal that missed nothing. Margaret was the finest woman I ever knew. Beautiful, accomplished, born to society, and she gave Vernon 11 years of devotion despite never once bearing him an hair, and he grieved her properly as a man ought, a Confess I find it difficult to see him settle now for, forgive my bluntness, considerably less. Then I hope you'll forgive mine in return, Mrs. Ashworth. Della's spine found its old steel. The one Ottilie Marsh and 4 years of small cruelties had never quite managed to break. I never knew your sister, and I've no doubt she was every bit the woman you say. I can't offer Vernon society polish or Delacroix's connections, and I can't offer him children, which I understand pains you on his behalf more than it pains him. What I can offer is a woman who sees him plainly, who isn't dazzled by the Circle Bar's acreage or his standing in Cheyenne, and who would take him exactly as gladly if he were the poorest hand on his own ranch. If that's less than Margaret gave him, I can't help it. It's what I have, and it's honestly given. You've been very direct with me, Mrs. Winslow, Cordelia said after a moment, setting down her teacup with a precision that suggested she was recalculating something behind her composed face. More direct than I expected, and considerably more direct than most women of my Cheyenne acquaintance would dare manage over a first cup of tea. Most women in your position would have wept, or apologized, or attempted to charm me into liking them. I've had 4 long years of practice being written off, Mrs. Ashworth, here and in Cheyenne alike. I find I've lost the taste for charm entirely. It never once bought me anything I actually wanted. No, Cordelia said slowly, I don't suppose it did. She studied Della a moment longer, something almost like the beginning of respect working its way into her expression. Sis Nash has been quite insistent that her Flora would suit the Circle Bar better. I confess I came prepared to agree with her, sight unseen. I find myself considerably less certain of that now than I was an hour ago. Cordelia studied her for a long, silent moment, something shifting behind her carefully composed face. Well, she said at last. At least you're not a coward about it. Margaret despised cowardice above all things. Perhaps you and she would have understood each other better than I gave you credit for. It wasn't approval, precisely, but it wasn't the dismissal Della had braced for either. And when Vernon came in from the range that evening to find his sister-in-law and Della sharing tea with something almost like ease between them, he stopped in the doorway with an expression of such open astonishment that Della laughed for the second time that week at his expense. The matter might have settled quietly into courtship from there, had Ottilie Marsh not decided, in the last week before Christmas, that a public reckoning was called for. She arranged it with the particular cruelty of a woman certain of her own righteousness, a church social. The whole basin in attendance, Mrs. Nash and a subdued, faintly relieved-looking Flora seated prominently near the front, and a moment, engineered to look accidental, where she raised the question of Della's suitability directly, before God and the congregation both. Della had almost not come at all. She'd stood in front of her small mirror an hour beforehand turning the question over, whether she had the strength left for one more evening of sidelong looks and half-heard whispers, and had gone only because staying home felt too much like conceding a fight she hadn't yet officially lost. She wore her best dress, the navy wool she'd mended and remended until the seams were sturdier than the day she bought it, and walked into the hall with her chin at the level 4 years of practice had taught her to hold it. I only wonder, Ottilie said, her voice pitched to carry across the crowded hall, whether Mr. Stallworth has fully considered what he's about. A man of his standing, his fortune, surely he owes the Circle Bar's future a wife who can secure it properly. It seems a shame to see all that land pass to nephews in Cheyenne who've never once worked a day of it, when a different match might have kept it in a direct line. The hall went quiet in the particular, awful way a room goes quiet when everyone present understands a blow has been struck and is waiting to see who bleeds. Della felt the old shame rise in her throat, familiar as an old coat, and opened her mouth to make some small, dignified retreat, the way she always had. A murmur went through the crowd, some scandalized, some merely hungry for spectacle, and Della saw Mrs. Nash lean toward her daughter with a satisfied little smile, as though Ottilie had done her a favor and might yet win the evening for Flora after all. Flora herself, Della noted through the roar of her own pulse, looked faintly embarrassed on Della's behalf, a small mercy in a room otherwise short on them. Vernon got there first. He crossed the hall unhurried, the same unhurried walk that had carried him through 2 droughts and a market collapse, and stopped in front of Ottilie with an expression that made the woman take an involuntary step backward. Mrs. Marsh, I have let a great many remarks about Mrs. Winslow pass without comment these past months, out of respect for the fact that gossip, like weather, generally exhausts itself if left alone. You have tested that patience past its limit tonight, in front of the whole congregation, and I find I no longer care to be gracious about it. His voice carried easily to every corner of the hall. I intend to marry Della Winslow. Not despite her circumstances, but because in 4 months of knowing her, she has shown me more courage, more honesty, and more genuine goodness than this entire basin has managed to muster toward her in as many years. My land will go where I choose to send it, and I have chosen. If any of you can't find it in yourselves to wish us well, I'd ask you at least find it in yourselves to be silent, the way decency requires. He turned to Della, who stood frozen by the punch table with her heart in her throat and the whole of Verdigris Basin watching. I'd meant to ask you somewhere quieter than this, he said, his voice dropping to something meant only for her, though the hushed hall heard every word regardless. But I find I'm through waiting for a private moment that suits everyone's comfort but our own. Della, will you marry me? The silence stretched, enormous and complete, and Della thought of 4 years of small humiliations, of Ottilie's boiled ham face on the church steps, of Cordelia's grudging respect earned over tea, of a shirt torn by scissors and a man too proud to simply ask for what he wanted, and found that none of it weighed anything at all against the plain fact of Vernon Storworth standing in front of the whole basin, unashamed, asking her the one question she had told herself for 4 years no man would ever ask. Yes, she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake. Yes. The hall erupted, some in genuine warmth, some merely swept along by the current of the moment, and Ottilie Marsh, Della noted with uncharitable satisfaction, she decided not to feel guilty about, slipped out the back door before the applause had even finished. They married in January, in a ceremony considerably larger than either of them had originally intended. Once half the basin decided that being present for the match Vernon Storworth had defended so publicly was preferable to admitting they doubted it. Cordelia came from Cheyenne and stood as witness, and wept without apology through the whole of the vows, and told Della afterward, gripping her hands, that Margaret would have liked her exceedingly, and that this was the highest compliment she knew how to give. Otis Reams drove the wedding wagon himself, decorated with more ribbon than a working ranch hand had any right to know how to arrange, and confided to Della at the reception, grinning around his pipe, that he'd known how the whole business would end from the very first Tuesday he'd driven her out to the Circle Bar with a basket of mending, and that he intended to remind Vernon of his own matchmaking genius at every opportunity for the remainder of both their natural lives. Vernon endured the teasing with a good grace Della suspected he'd have shown no one else, and admitted, dancing with her once the fiddler struck up something slow enough for a man his age to manage, that Otis had rather more right to gloat than most. Della moved into the Circle Bar's ranch house that spring with her own small trunk of belongings, and a lifetime of careful mending habits that Vernon teased her about relentlessly and never once asked her to abandon. Flora Nash, to everyone's mild surprise, married a young lawyer from Cheyenne the following autumn and seemed, by all accounts, considerably happier for it than she'd ever have been mistress of a ranch house she'd shown no real interest in running. Mrs. Nash, for her part, transferred her matchmaking energies elsewhere and never again mentioned the Circle Bar within Della's hearing. Della never bore Vernon children, and he never once in all the years that followed made her feel the lack of it. Filled the house instead with nephews' visits and neighbor children who adored the woman who kept peppermint drops in her apron pocket, and told her often, without prompting, that she had given him back a home he'd thought he'd buried with Margaret, and that no accounting of a woman's worth that left that out was an accounting worth listening to. Ottilie Marsh, for her part, never again remarked on Della's suitability within Vernon's hearing, or anyone else's, having learned rather thoroughly the cost of doing so, and on quiet evenings, mending some shirt or other by the parlor lamp out of pure old habit rather than necessity, Della would sometimes catch Vernon watching her with the same startled, grateful look he'd worn that first October evening, as though he still couldn't quite believe his own good fortune in having asked. She would set the needle down, and he would come sit beside her without a word, and they would watch the fire together, the way two people do who have stopped needing conversation to fill every silence between them. She thought every single time. Of 4 years spent believing herself written off by a world that measured a woman's worth in sons she never bore, and of Ottilie Marsh's bald ham face on the church steps, and of a shirt torn deliberately by a proud man's scissors, because he hadn't yet learned to ask plainly for what he wanted. None of it, she understood now, had ever been the whole truth of her, no matter how thoroughly the Basin had once insisted otherwise. The whole Basin's cruel arithmetic had been wrong about her from the very start, and being chosen, truly chosen, by a man who saw her plainly, who had stood up in front of the whole congregation and called her worth more than their small unkindness could measure, was worth every hard year it had taken to arrive at it.